Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. This is Emily Cohen at Faith Trust Institute, and I'm the program coordinator here. And I'm here to welcome you into the webinar today with Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis and Reverend K. Ray Hill, who will be presenting today on sexual abuse in the Black Church, historical perspectives toward practical solutions. I can see people are logging in and joining us, and as we do that, I just have a couple of technical things to cover. If you are having any trouble hearing or seeing, you can send me a direct message by finding my name in the drop-down menu of the chat box, which should be on the right side of your screen. And once we get going today, I can help you troubleshoot any of those problems. The chat box there and the Q&A box below it are the places that you will use to ask questions of our presenters today, and you can type them into the boxes and click send. Please feel free to type your questions in at any point, and I'll be holding on to them until the time comes. Another thing to note is that a PDF handout of the slides will be emailed to you later this afternoon, so you'll be able to return to what was covered in today's presentation. If any additional resources or books are mentioned during the conversation, then I'll go ahead and add that to the follow-up email as well. And lastly, this is being recorded and will be made available on our website soon, so welcome also to those of you who are listening to the recording of this. As you can see at the bottom of your screen there, this webinar is sponsored by Justice and Witness Ministries of the United Church of Christ as part of their webinar series, Addressing Sexual and Domestic Violence, Tools for Faith Leaders. You can visit their website there, which is on your screen, to learn more about the series. So thank you to Justice and Witness Ministries for helping to make this webinar possible. So now on to our presenters. I'm happy to welcome Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis and Reverend K. Ray Hill to the webinar today. Reverend Sharon Ellis Davis is a United Church of Christ pastor and is the co-founder and senior pastor of God Can Ministries in Fort Heights, Illinois. Dr. Davis also serves as an adjunct professor and the director of the Center for African American Ministries and Black Church Studies at McCormick Theological Seminary. And Dr. Davis also recently retired from her full-time position as a Chicago police officer of over 31 years, where she worked in patrol and as a criminalist in the crime laboratory. Reverend K. Ray Hill is an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ, and he currently serves as pastor-teacher at Maple Temple UCC, located in Raleigh, North Carolina. K. Ray has 22 years of pastoral experience, 7 years as a rural church pastor, and 15 as an urban church pastor. Reverend Hill is an education consultant assigned to the Southern Region for local church ministries of the United Church of Christ. He is a UCC history, theology, and polity instructor for the Pastoral Leadership Development Program. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here today, and I will go ahead and pass it off to Sharon, who will get us started.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the state that you're in. It is really exciting to be here today to talk about solutions and to begin to have conversations in this short hour around sexual abuse in the African American church. What we want to do today is to begin some conversation. Certainly we cannot cover the whole topic in an hour, but we want to at least bring to the awareness, to the forefront, the actuality of sexual abuse in the Black church. Begin to give you some kind of educational perspective and historical perspective of why this abuse may take place in African American congregations. It's important to know that abuse is abuse, regardless of what type of congregation it is. But we need to begin to look at our church from a historical perspective as we begin to seek out solutions, methods of intervention. And so this time is meant to do that, to look at some practical solutions to answer questions that you might have that we may attempt to answer at the end of this time. So we hope that what we present in this hour will be beneficial to you moving forward. So I want to begin with looking at the history and privilege and power in the Black pulpit from a historical perspective. And first I want to say, in response to even this topic of Black church, that there's no typical Black church description. Black church, there's no quote-unquote Black church. We are all different. But Where we are similar is that we're talking about the Black church in the context of those churches that down through the years have involved themselves in the struggle for human rights, in the struggle for civil rights, in the struggle for equality that has been known as, quote, the Black church. But however we look or describe what the Black church is or who the Black church is for you, we have to become aware that there is a contextual analysis and a present reality within the Black community that will lend itself to some common experiences around developing healthy boundaries, education of how we need to do the work of developing healthy boundaries that can be directly related to our historical context. And so when I talk about the Black church, let's understand that I'm talking about it in that kind of perspective, and not saying that there is a Black church that is alike across the board. And so what comes to mind for me is the historical importance of the African American church traditionally. And in the midst of slavery, in the midst of Jim Crow and continued racism that has dehumanized, disembodied, and disenfranchised, and even disempowered African American people, the Black church, quote, historically, began to develop itself into a place of power and empowerment for African Americans, especially African American men. As a matter of fact, the Black church historically has been the only place where African American men could be, where they can be called a doctor and didn't have to have a degree. So it certainly was a place of esteem, especially for African American men who were disempowered in white society. This empowerment gave agency to the church. It lifted the spirits of those who were oppressed, and the church became a place of not only spiritual healing, but it became a place of political empowerment. However, one of the results of this empowerment became a misuse of power, especially as it relates to issues of sexuality by the male pastor, and a tolerance on part of the membership, both male and female. And so there were little spaces for accountability, and this set the stage for the abuse of power in the Black church that we're trying to talk about today. It's important to understand that where there are many African American churches that are healthy, there are many African American pastors, both male and female, who are doing what is right. That we have to still begin to address this issue, because the sexual abuse that takes place in the Black church and in the church in general is still too high. It still leaves people disempowered, especially the women and children that are victims of it. And so it's worth thinking about within this historical context, so that we can begin to find solutions and methods of prevention and intervention, so that we can begin to develop a culturally specific way of intervening that takes into account the abuse, the dehumanization from slavery, Jim Crow, what has happened, racism, down through the years, because we continue to be impacted by issues of racism even to this day. And so when we begin to look at how we end up as a people compensating for that, we have to take that into consideration, that perhaps in many cases of abuse there's been an overcompensation. And so this is just a quick way, we can come back to it later, of trying to get us to understand and be on the same page as while we're talking about this. Yes.
Wanted to call your attention to a quote by Samuel D. Proctor. In a book along with Gardner Taylor, we have this ministry, The Heart of the Pastor's Vocation. He made this statement: being appointed a spiritual leader, under shepherd, and a herald of the good news of the Son of God is an awesome commission from God. To undertake such a vocation for light and transient reason, to use it as a quick leap to prominence or gratification for a boundless and pathological egocentric is to profane it. And I lift that up as a place to begin helping people understand that those of us who are spiritual leaders and under shepherds have been given a great responsibility, and to remind folk of that reality. And as I look at that quote and put that before you, as we try to look at this problem that has been evident in the black church, and sometimes people don't realize how powerful it is to be called of God, to be given that responsibility, and they use it for wrong reasons. And in our next slide, when we start talking about the misuse of this ministry of power that was given, God gave the call, and we go in as leaders, but we can misuse that for a host of reasons. Some of those reasons are just because of economic reasons and the stresses that go with that. Many times because of lack of accountability, knowledge, lack of training, people don't even realize that they're misusing the power of the office. We get this sense of entitlement and this self-interest that gets lifted up over and over again. And in many cases, sometimes the isolation of being a leader in the church where it's only you or that pastor in that role. And the issues around sexuality as well as this need in churches sometimes to be in denial that there is a problem in the church, that my pastor is not doing that. And there's always, in many places, this great need to protect the pastor rather than to investigate even when allegations come up. And as a result, this misuse of the power continues to happen because we tend not to call it out and deal with it openly. Next slide.
The things that I'm painfully aware of, and it might have been just the way things were back when I was a child, being brought up in the church all the time. We knew that there were roles. There were roles for the pastor and men of the church, and there were roles for women of the church, and generally that was a situation of dominance and subordination, that women tended to play the subordinate role. The leaders of the church were men, for the most part, and pastors were placed on a pedestal. There was an expectation that the pastor had the answers, that pastors had the power, that pastors had the control. And in the midst of the cultural and the historical situation, there was also emasculation of pastors. And so, as we said earlier, then the church found a way to compensate for that by putting the pastor on a pedestal, by honoring the pastor in ways that the pastor had not been honored in society. And so culturally, the roles were not clearly defined, that there were not expectations that were clear. We had dual communities. We had churches that were family churches, dual relationships. We had business partners that were members of the church. There were not clearly defined ways in which we boundaried ourselves in the church. And so that has historically also led itself to a clergy sexual abuse. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was doing counseling at a counseling center, one of the young ladies that came to the counseling center, and she was having issues as an adult, and she was trying to get married, but there were some things in her way. And what was in her way was the whole issue of being sexually abused by her pastor, which was also her uncle. And this particular pastor had given her a place of honor in the church by allowing her to ride in the front seat of the car when they would visit churches, and and she would honor him by by serving him in the church and making sure that he had his water. Well, that relationship, not being clearly defined, not having the boundaries, ended up with him taking sexually advantage of her, and he raped her, and he paid her for that rape with money. And with candy and with different kinds of privileges that she could get. And so culturally there's been a sense of acceptance of that in our churches that we need to be aware of because that has lent itself to the abuse of women, to the abuse, yes, of men, to the abuse of children, both male and female children who are even the least vulnerable. But certainly it's been a place in the black church where women have been taken advantage of because of those cultural roles. Next.
As we look at issues of power and vulnerability, I want to call our attention back to the scriptures and look at Ezekiel 34, where it says that the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord said. Woe to the shepherds. Woe to the shepherds who feed. I'm missing out on me. It says, woe to the shepherd who does not feed the sheep of Israel and only take care of themselves. Should not be shepherds who take care of the flock. You eat the curd, you clothe yourself with the wool and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and bitterly, so that they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. And I wanted to lift that up because in that scripture it helps us understand that there is a sense of accountability as well as a sense of vulnerability in the life of the church. And God wants us to hold shepherds accountable, even as sheep are vulnerable. Next slide.
This gives you some idea of the statistics and research that was done at Baylor University. And you can read that 3% of women attending a congregation have been objects of clergy sexual misconduct as adults. And then in an average congregation of 400 persons, 60% being women, there are an average of 7 women who have experienced clergy sexual misconduct. And what that means in the church, this is not just in the black church, these are statistics all over. But I think what that means specifically for the black church, again, coming back to our history of subordination and dominance, and the control in the black church historically been by men, and that women have been protected, both men and women have been protected of clergy, especially when it comes to sexual abuse. There have been cases where people, women other than the pastor, have had children by the pastor, by their clergy leader, and the kids were whisked away, and the family was whisked away to another congregation so that the pastor could be protected. And many times where in male and female churches where most of the percentage are women, that women have been blamed and women have been shamed, pastors have been protected, we've been, as women, claimed to be seductive and Jezebels, as the sister has said, and so it has really created an environment in the black church for this to happen even at an escalated percentage that probably is not even reported because we're either hiding it or we're not really speaking out about it. Next. So then it's important to think about this whole this issue as a collective of what does this do. When a minister engages in sexualized behavior, whether that clergy is male or female, with the congregant, the client, the employee, student, or staff, it's important to know that it's a violation of the role and a breach of fiduciary responsibility. And that's a way of saying this should not happen. Anybody who has the role of pastor as the one that is the visionary of the church cannot violate that role and must be held accountable. It's a misuse of authority and power. There's nothing evil about power. But when you misuse it for your advantage, as the scripture prior to that said, you're using it for your own benefit, for your own comfort, then it's a misuse of power and authority. It's taking advantage of the vulnerability. And as a pastor, the power lies there. Whether a person perceives that they have the power or not, the power lies there. And so then the congregants, both male and female, are subordinate to that in order of the males in the congregation, females and children who are the most vulnerable. And anything that is done without meaningful consent is certainly an abuse of power, and it is wrong, and it is sinful, and it just can't happen in our communities, in our churches, and we need to begin to find ways to combat that kind of abuse in our congregations. So this next slide talks about the goals. And so what we want to do as a goal, regardless of what the context, regardless of what the analysis is that we want to maintain the integrity of this ministerial relationship. And the way that we do that, and you will hear this word throughout our conversation, accountability, accountability, accountability. We want to know that in the church that our main purpose is to protect those who are vulnerable. And so who are vulnerable? The congregation, the client if it's a counseling section, the employees that work for the faith institution, students, staff, seminarians, anybody who is vulnerable over someone that is in power has to be protected in the midst of what's going on. So that is our goal, protection and maintaining our integrity. Next.
What does a healthy church look like? As we raise this concern, and as the word once again goes out, accountability. And it's this tension between accountability and autonomy, because churches have this ability to stand on their own, and yet and still there needs to be this sense of accountability in that church for what the leadership does, particularly in terms of pastoral relationship. But it's also important that we empower the laity by educating them to boundaries, to help people understand that what has been permitted in the past, what has seemed to be okay, is no longer okay. And begin helping people to question what is going on and whether or not that is right. But when people don't understand the role of boundaries and don't fully understand the sense of accountability, it allows things to go on that really shouldn't happen. And that's why I want to call your attention to the article that was sent to you, which talks about sexual misconduct basically in the church. And one of the persons that lift up in the midst of that is an Eddie Long who had lots of allegations against him and what he was did with some young men in the church. But even in the midst of all that came out of that and what was in the press was where there was no checks and balances on what he was able to do. And when we look through this article, we see some other things which can be frightening for any church. One of the lines that says that the prosperity gospel breeds a culture in which pastors are too important to be human, let alone to make mistakes. Their personal lives are their most valuable asset and are protected as such by church employees and congregants alike. And one of the things is that we, many times in black churches, protect the pastor over protecting people who are actually in the pew and being taken advantage of. The last thing in this particular article that lists up that in 2012 it's difficult to see how these questions of accountability can be thoughtfully adjudicated. And one reason may be is that these organizations, trustees, and church boards are often stuffed with friends and family members, making them far less willing to risk the consequences or whistleblowing. And so therefore we have to begin educating folks to let them understand that it is critical that they have some understanding of boundaries itself. Next slide. What we need to know about boundaries. One of the critical pieces is to help people understand that boundaries help us maintain clear professional relationships. There are guidelines not to shackle people from being able to do things, but it's to help them stay in their proper relationship. It also gives us a perspective when we have a crisis. And when people in a congregation fully understand what boundaries are, it can signal to people that it's a safe place and that you can trust what goes on in that place. And one of the most critical pieces, I think, of boundaries is the fact it is there to protect the clergy as well as the congregant, and helping them understand that. I mean, and one of the things, as a simple example of being real clear, not having a pastor be alone in a building with a female, in this case a female member, without some checks and balances, that over time that could be looked at in a bad way, both for the pastor as well as the lady who is there with him, in this case. But to say, hey, have some boundaries, that two people, there ought to be somebody else in the building. It's a simple matter, but you have to educate people to that reality. Next slide.
So it's all about maintaining the ministerial integrity. I love the scripture and how it's done in quotes and seek first the kingdom of God. And so when we think about the kingdom of God, we don't think about harming people. When we think about the kingdom of God, we want to live a life and help others to live a life where they can experience heaven on earth. As the Lord's prayer says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so if we begin to, the conversation on ministerial integrity first with thinking about what does it mean to bring about God's kingdom and to seek God's kingdom first, rather than to seek our own needs first, to seek to feel our own desires first, to seek to disempower a segment of the population so that I can be empowered, to seek to have my own needs met. Or am I going to trust that if I do the kingdom kind of work, bringing peace on earth and making sure that we understand that what we are doing down here impacts the kingdom, that I will trust that God will add those things to me that I need. And so we have to really be serious in our church about setting and using boundaries to shape our pastoral congregate relationships. I remember a pastor said before that he was in his robe, and the next thing he knew, a lady was hugging him inside of his robe before he even knew what happened. And if that's the case, which I doubt seriously, we need to begin to become aware, and that's why awareness is so important, of the boundaries we need to shape, to have trusting pastoral and congregate relationships, so that people in the congregation and people in other places will understand that they can trust us. And we have to be responsible as pastors, even if the congregants don't have those boundaries, to be aware of our power, to be aware of the attraction of others to power, to be aware that of our own needs and our own desires, and understand that that is not to be satisfied by abusing and misusing our congregants. And so boundaries have to shape that, which means we need policies within our church. If we are independent churches, then we need to sit down with others that have already established boundary policies and begin to establish policies yourself in your own church. And those policies should also set forth clear guidelines where I believe that the congregant will know exactly what they can do if I as a pastor cross those boundaries, and if I as a pastor cross them sexually. And so even establishing boundaries and accountable policies, I shouldn't try to protect myself as a pastor within those boundaries. We have to have that. We have to be accountable. When Ray was talking about the Eddie Long situation, one of the painful things for me with that accusation, and no one knew what really had happened. We all might have had our opinions. But when Pastor Eddie Long was accused of this, the first thing he did was he said something to the congregation. He says, "We are under attack." And I thought immediately back to what I said earlier about our historical context of racism and our mistrust of the criminal justice system, the sense that black men are being destroyed by white America. It felt like to me that he played on that by saying we are under attack, and immediately the congregants, those that would, because I'm sure that there were some that were not, but they were silent. But those that were in numbers grew up, it rose up because we are under attack is a buzzword for racism in America, slavery, dehumanization, demasculation of black men. We are under attack. And so where was the accountability in that? And so we have to begin to hold ourselves accountable as pastors, but we also need to develop policies that will allow others to hold us accountable. For me, personal integrity is part of that accountability. If I am accused as a pastor of anything, the first thing I need to do is make myself available for the investigation, not call on the congregation and say we're under attack so that I can get allies, and so that everybody that wants to say something out of their voices are silent. And now if I'm in the congregation and I say something about the pastor, I'm going to be attacked by that group. And so personal integrity says, let us find out what's going on. Either there's some misunderstanding that it did not happen, or I'm downright being accused, but I open myself up, I open our records up, I open the church up to that possibility. In fact, since this is so important, why don't I not even serve in this position for a while, and I'll let my assistants take over, so that I won't be a distraction to the investigation. For me, that's being accountable. For me, that's having integrity. And then the other thing that we have to begin to do is practice self-care. We have to make sure that we are in touch with our own needs, which means that as pastors, we have work to do. we have work to do. We cannot just say, well, it's a small church and I'm a single pastor and I need to make people in the congregation because no one else is around. We need to do the work of finding those people that we can socialize with outside of that context of the church. We have to begin to know what it is that we need so that we can find a way, in a healthy way, to get those needs met. But many times we haven't done that. And as this next slide says, that sometimes we have to even confess, as Reverend Dr. Kirk Byron Jones quoted, we must confess insufficient self-care as a subtle but lethal expression of personal and social violence. When we fail to take care of ourselves, when we fail to do the work that we're supposed to do, to meet the needs that we have, when we do that, then we are number one, being violent to ourselves, that we are being abusive to ourselves, that we are not loving ourselves. And so when that is happening, how can we care for and love other people when we have neglected ourselves? And so we have to begin to, number one, start from the place where, as pastors, we have to take care of ourselves and not put that on someone else to take care of us. We have to do the work. We have to want to do the work. And we need to start off by confessing that we have not done that well. We've bragged about being too busy. We've bragged about not having a day off. That is nothing to brag about. It is violence, it's social violence, it's personal violence, and it's not good for us if we're going to do ministry in a healthy way. Next slide.
How do we get in this position where we don't do the proper self-care? And one of the places and one of the ways is this whole sense of denial that we need it, this delusion in our own minds that that's important for us. Many think about their invincibility. They want to be a Superman or Superwoman in terms of making sure that they can do it all. The other, this indispensability piece about how important. It's important for me to be at every meeting. It's important for me to be at and everything, every time the church door is open. It's important that I keep myself in all the things that are going on in the life of the church. And at another level, there's a lack of margin in terms of there's not enough space between the load and the limit of a human capacity to be able to do those things. And so we don't do the thing for self-care. We have to be very careful about allowing people to project things on us and for us accepting that. And of course, many of us, this need to be needed can get us in trouble to the point that we always want to be available to folks. And even as you look at Jesus as a model, Jesus had times when he definitely got a way to take care of himself, even when he did stop along the way sometimes to have compassion on other folks. But eventually he got a way to pray and do those kinds of things. For self-care, you have to understand that to be available to somebody in a healthy way, you have to take care of yourself. And we have to put that not only in the minds of our pastors, we have to also make that a requirement with our laity, helping them understand to give pastors spaces and requirements to make sure they do take care of themselves, take a day off, not feel like they have to be here all the time, and do that. And the way, in terms of the next slide, about prevention, is to make sure that there are some healthy boundaries there. So when people walk into situations, if they're taking proper care of themselves, then they can be very careful when boundaries are there to help them. And let me give you an example. When a person is not getting the proper nurture and love out of another relationship that is the proper relationship for them. And they come into a church setting where they are still needing to be loved and to be affirmed. That's a place where all of a sudden somebody who would have been, if they had been in a healthy place, would have not made some mistakes. But because there were not boundaries there, that person who we would call a wanderer walks up against and crosses the line, he embraces somebody, and that goes further than what should have happened. Because he, in this case, he, as a pastor, is in a needy place, and the person who he hugs may not understand the dynamics of power and all of that. They might be in a place and feel like they have to accommodate, and all of a sudden, because there are no boundaries, nobody else there to keep them in check, none of those other little things that could be around people is not there, then you have a situation where a mistake is made. When prevention fails because of not having healthy boundaries, when people don't do good self-care, then intervention is necessary. We can no longer allow things to happen in our church, in the black church, and sit back and say, well, it happens at church. It's okay. It's never okay. Intervention is necessary when something happens and the prevention fails. And we have to have policies in place to make sure that there is a process that people are held accountable. Pastors are held accountable. Because when we don't do that, and it becomes normative, and it becomes an expectation that that can happen, and nobody's going to say anything, nothing is actually going to be happening. We'll deny because we don't want our community to know that our pastor crossed the line. That creates major problems, and we are teaching folk indirectly that that's acceptable behavior, and that's why we want to raise the flag today that these things have to stop. We stop it first and foremost by making first the clergy aware of their responsibilities and staying within boundaries, but also by making congregations understand there ought to be boundaries out there that people stay within so that you can protect both the clergy and the congregation. And as a local church pastor, what I can tell you that when anything happens with the local church, whether it was the pastor who did it or somebody in the congregation who did it, it's the whole church that gets the black eye, and it's the whole church, to some degree, whose witness is raised in question. And then there's a group of people outside the church who will not come in the church because of the things that are allowed to go on, because they don't see what people are held accountable. I pass it on to you, Sharon.
Great. Thank you both to Carrie and Sharon. Certainly generating some good questions that I'm seeing in comments. And it's clear that those who are joining us today have experience with many of the topics that were raised today. So we're going to take the next about 10 minutes, and I will pass out some questions to our presenters today. Going back to perhaps this last slide might be a good segue. There's a person asking, as a church community who is just starting, they're about 1 year old, what are some things that we should have in place to protect those who are vulnerable?
Well, I guess the first thing is just some general policies about what happens in terms of space. Checks and balancing of people being in the church by themselves, people being with young people, and making sure that it's just not one-on-one relationships, a lot of that going on. Some of the normative pieces that sit back and say, how do we do church, not going, particularly depending on what your context is, going into buildings, and being in spaces after hours and things like that as ways of saying, having some boundaries that help people understand. One of the policies I made, because I'm in an urban context, I always tell women, don't go in the building by themselves. That's just a simple piece that if you wait till somebody else gets there, because you never know who might be in the building, if there's nobody else around. Some of those little things like that, I think is critical as you start out. And then if you start out even with youth groups and making sure that youth leaders and a single parent, a single child alone, that you say, wait a minute, we need to make sure other people are there, just to protect both youth workers as well as young people in any kind of setting. So those are some of the things I think of initiatives.
And one of the things that I was thinking about, well, several things, is just asking, is this church part of a larger denomination that already has policies that can help you shape yours? But if it's an independent church, then developing some safe church policies in terms of what does it mean when you have a youth group. How many sponsors, adult sponsors, do you have to have per 3 or 4 youth that are going on an outing? So what kind of policies can I begin to create that will ensure safety and make the congregant feel safe and secure, and accountability with both male and female. Key. Making sure that we know who has keys to the church, that there's an alarm system that will tell you which personal combinations, so you'll know who was in that particular church at any particular time. And I think most of all for me it's about shared power. It's about understanding that as pastors, that pastors don't have to be in charge of everything, don't have to have the last word, that there's some kind of sense in the bylaws and the way that we do church that shares the power, shares the leadership, so that everyone in the congregation feels empowered, and that power is just not coming from the top, but it's spread. A powerful person is a person, for me, that can empower others. And so if you're in power and in charge as pastor, and you're not empowering others to have that same piece, you're going to be subject to hurting someone and injuring someone strictly by how you're inevitably start misusing that power.
Thank you. That's helpful. There's a couple questions regarding statistics, and so I'll try to summarize those. People are wondering, Sharon and Kaylee, if you have any information on statistics in general about clergy abuse in black churches, and also about female perpetrators of abuse or clergy. Do you know of any places that might be good starting points for statistics?
I think a few years ago, and it might be this study that's on the statistics, but I'm not quite sure, but there is a study that recently came out, it might have been from this university, that talks about clergy abuse. And I don't have that policy. I think I have it somewhere in my computer files. But that the study, it was like we were excited about the study because there had not been prior to that many studies. And so it could come from the ones we had in the PowerPoint that you had. You could start first by checking that. But in terms of me knowing what those stats are, I don't know. What I do know is that when it comes to power, if we don't change the way in which we share it and the way in which we understand it historically, the way in which we take care of ourselves, that both men and women are vulnerable to being abusers and abused. And so I do know that both are, that we all are vulnerable, both male and female. Historically, it started with men, but now that women are gaining power, it can happen anymore with women abusing male clergy, female or children. And so no one is exempt from this happening, but no, I don't know stats.
I don't know of any stats myself.
Okay. If we do find any in the meantime, I'll be sure to send those out. Okay, a couple more questions. There's a woman who says that our church has recently been affected by clergy sexual abuse, and the bishop has refused to allow church leaders there to talk about it or to even share the 800 number where people might be able to go for help. And so what advice do you have for the lay people in the congregation in terms of what to do next?
Well, once again, when we start dealing with episcopal structures and with bishops in terms of how church policies, because sometimes there's church policies that's at work there. One thing that I think, and you really have to work within that whole denominational piece, is that community needs some direction and some help and some healing. And it may be that there's some resource persons that can come into play for the local church, so they can at least talk about that and have somebody with some skill set that comes from the local community if it's known outside of that congregation. Most of the time with allegations, until people have been cleared or have the evidence clearly laid out, there is a need to keep things silent until they can complete their investigation. I don't know where you are in the process, but sometimes when the congregation knows, or when persons in the congregation know, there needs to be some healing for that congregation. And if the bishop will not do it, it may be because of their policies and procedures of how they handle those kinds of things.
And I have an issue with people that forbid me to do anything. So I'm probably not the best person to answer this, but two things I can say. If the bishop is trying to be silent around an investigation, that's one thing. But if the bishop is denying leaders and people in the church an opportunity to talk about such an important issue, then two things I think probably need to happen. Number one, you need to be empowered as a layperson enough to go outside that source and get the information you need. Because I think that the more educated you are about a subject, the more you can effectively intervene, the more you can effectively be aware, and those opportunities are an important time that we can begin to talk about criminal sexual assault and other areas of abuse. And if the bishop is not allowing that kind of conversation, then he or she is missing an opportunity for us in the church to get better. The other thing I was thinking about is that this may be a sign of even more kind of control. It may be a sign of not really genuinely caring for whom you are as a congregation, or the duty to protect congregants and to love congregants and to respond to their needs and take care of the vulnerable. And sometimes there may come a point in your life where you need to decide, is this the church I need to be in? And that always has to be there as we even talk about marriage. Is this the marriage I need? Is this what God is calling me for? At some point, we have to begin to, yes, push out churches. But at some point, if the church is injuring and not allowing you to grow and learn, then we may have to mourn the loss of that church and begin to find a community that can support who we are and will help us to be better and get better.
Thank you. Sharon, this is a question that was directed towards you, but K-Ray, please comment after Sharon. This person is saying that he is a minister in a church that has a history of sexual abuse, and while misconduct did occur about 10 to 15 years ago, it's still carried in the congregation and is making it really difficult to now address issues of domestic violence and sexual violence. And this person is asking what actions the men of the congregation can take to make sure that the women of the congregation know that they are supported. What action plans would you recommend?
That is, I'm impressed with that question, and I'm happy to hear that someone cares about the congregation, because in the long run, there's injury in the congregation after this kind of event happens. And I'm thinking of finding spaces within our faith institutions where we can have real conversations, where there can be truth telling. where stories can be told of vulnerabilities, where we can talk about our feelings, because this stuff needs to come out. Where we can actually get that out, where we can begin a process of healing, bringing in a pastoral care person or a CPE person or a supervisor who has experience with working with wounded congregations, and really put forth a plan and develop a method of how we're going to begin to approach the healing. And part of that is truth-telling. The other part is finding places of forgiveness, the ability to let things go, expressing anger, finding out what people need through their conversations to begin to rebuild trust and faith, and just have an honest conversation, because it's a journey toward healing. But to ignore it is to ignore the body and the soul that has been wounded. The body and the soul and the spirit has been damaged because of what is happening, and that's something that we can't do.
And I agree with Sharon said, but I also would add this other component piece, that once you have the dialogue and the conversation, there might need to be a service of healing of the congregation, where people can bring some things and more or less just drop those things as a symbolic way of acknowledging that this has been part of our past, and here are some of the scars of that, but also have a service of healing around that once a conversation has been had. I don't believe that it's helpful just to sit back and call for healing without conversations, without people being able to talk about what it is that has happened. And the other thing that happens in a community when it becomes a part of the fabric of that community, that everybody knows about it, and it is something that's still talked about, and maybe even something that is still done in that community, some kind of interventions need to be in terms of that. And the fact that the men want to make sure that the women understand, sometimes just getting them together in the same room around a subject. And sometimes there are some scriptural references that you lift up as a biblical story to at least start the dialogue. And sometimes some of the woundedness can come out without directing to some of those other factual pieces, at least as a way to get some of the information out and some of the pain out through some kind of biblical study, then go into a service of healing for the church.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for that question. That is the end of our time, so I just want to pause and just say thank you for all the questions and those that we didn't get to in the comments that you have all sent in. They've been very helpful, and I will share the rest of them with our presenters so that they know the things that you're thinking about and questions that you're asking. I'm going to move to the next slide, which is a list of resources. And while this slide is up, and a reminder that you will be getting this in an email later today from me, I just want to invite our two presenters to offer any final words. Sharon, would you like to begin?
I just want to lift up how important education is for a community of faith. What we allow in our context sends a message of both what can be healing and hurting. And if we don't properly educate and show forth what is healthy, we do a disservice for the community of faith in which we are a part. And the last thing I want to say is not calling attention to sexual abuse is not an answer. To acknowledge that something has happened, if not in your own congregation, but in the community, is important so people can have a place to talk about it in healthy ways and take it off of the gossip columns or the other avenues of how we do destructive things to the life of the church. Because there's a community out there that needs the church, and the church needs to be a safe and healthy place for people to come.
I just want to acknowledge, as I started in the beginning, that we have many churches that are doing wonderful jobs as pastors and congregants. But also to warn all of us as pastors that we are all capable of wandering We're all capable of that, and so it's important that we teach boundaries in our churches for our pastors and for our laity, so that both can be informed and empowered. It's also, when we look at the context of slavery, Jim Crow, we need not use that as an excuse anymore. That we understand that we have a history, but we need to not act on that history in ways that abuse and misuse people and overcompensate for what has been done. We need to get off we need to come to consciousness with what we're doing and why we're doing it, and stop working, as we talk about in racism training, anti-racism training, get off of automatics and begin to think about what it is that we do. And we need to remember, as in the Methodist book, do no harm. And that we are called to have integrity and accountability, and part of that is making sure that we have shared responsibilities with male and female. If we don't do that, both male and female will potentially harm, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to both Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis and Reverend K. Ray Hill for spending time with us today and providing all this helpful information, and to all of you who are joining the live webinar for taking time to pay attention to this topic today with us. I just want to let you know that when you close the window today, you'll be prompted to fill out a short feedback form, and we do appreciate any information that you have regarding today's presentation or ideas that you have for us for future webinars. I also want to let you know that the next offering in this series, sponsored by the United Church of Christ, will be a webinar on December 4th, when Reverend Luke Grove of the United Church of Christ will present on teen violence and bullying and what we can do to stop it. So you can visit our website, which is faithcommitment.org, to register for free for this and also see a full list of upcoming webinars and other resources. Keep an eye on your inbox for the PDF copy of the slides today. And I got also a note from one of the participants with a source for statistics, so I'll be sending that out to all of you as well. So thanks again to Reverend Dr. Davis and Reverend Hill. This concludes the presentation. Take care.